The morning encounter. Jamal West always valued his mornings. They gave him the quiet reflection and peace that helped prepare him for his busy days. On this particular day, the city's familiar rhythm felt both calming and energizing. The sun was just rising, casting an amber glow over the skyline, and the air had that early autumn crispness that always put Jamal in a good mood. He was a man in his mid-30s, tall with a lean, athletic build, and his presence naturally commanded respect. His skin was the color of rich mahogany, and his close-cropped hair and neatly trimmed beard gave him a polished look. Today, like most days, he was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit with a subtle checkered pattern. His shoes, polished to a mirror-like shine, clicked softly on the pavement as he made his way to his car. He had just finished breakfast at his favorite neighborhood diner, a little hole-in-the-wall place where the waitstaff greeted him by name. The warmth from the earlier interaction stayed with him. His scrambled eggs and turkey bacon had been perfect, just the way he liked them. He looked forward to his day. It was packed with meetings, and a dinner with his mother later was the highlight he had been looking forward to all week. As Jamal approached his sleek black sedan, he checked his phone. His mother had sent a text confirming their dinner. "Don't forget 7 p.m. sharp. Love you." He smiled at her predictability and responded quickly, reassuring her that he hadn't forgotten. Just as he was about to unlock his car, Jamal noticed 2 police officers walking down the street toward him. They were both white, dressed in standard-issue uniforms, with their badges gleaming in the sunlight. At first, he didn't think much of it. Police often patrolled this area, but something about their approach felt different. Their eyes were locked on him, and their pace quickened the closer they got. Jamal's stomach tightened. He instinctively straightened his posture, but his face remained calm. He had grown up in a world where being a black man meant you were often subjected to extra scrutiny. His father had drilled certain lessons into him from a young age. Always keep your hands visible. Always be polite, and never make any sudden movements. Those teachings were ingrained in his behavior, and today they would guide him once more. The first officer, whose badge read Riley, came to a stop just a few feet away from Jamal. He was a stocky man, with a stern expression and a posture that suggested he was used to asserting authority. Behind him, the second officer, Jenkins, stood slightly to the side, his hand resting ominously close to his holster. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Riley said, his voice carrying a sharp edge. It wasn't a request. It was a command. There was no greeting, no explanation. Jamal felt a small knot form in his stomach, but he maintained his calm exterior. "Yes, officer. How can I help you?" Jamal replied, his voice polite, but not submissive. He met Riley's gaze, standing straight, but making sure not to appear confrontational. "I need to see some ID," Riley demanded, his tone bordering on aggressive. Jenkins remained silent, but his presence was intimidating. He stood with his legs slightly apart, a hand still near his holster, watching Jamal carefully. Jamal was taken aback by the suddenness of the demand. There was no obvious reason for the officers to approach him. He wasn't speeding, he hadn't violated any laws, and he certainly wasn't causing any trouble. But he knew better than to question their authority directly in this situation. These interactions could escalate quickly if not handled carefully. "Of course," Jamal said, keeping his voice even and non-threatening. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket, mindful of the fact that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license. Officer Riley snatched the ID from Jamal's hand, his eyes scanning the card as though searching for something to confirm his suspicions. He passed it to Jenkins, who examined it briefly before nodding. Still, their expressions didn't soften. "What are you doing in this area?" Riley asked, his eyes narrowing. There was an unmistakable tone of accusation in his voice. Jamal blinked. "I live around here. I just finished breakfast at the diner down the street," he replied calmly, gesturing in the direction of the restaurant. But Riley didn't seem satisfied with the answer. His eyes flicked to Jamal's suit and then to his car, as if those items themselves were suspicious. Jamal could almost see the thought process in Riley's mind. A black man in an expensive suit, driving a luxury car in this part of town. Something didn't add up for him. Jenkins shifted his weight slightly, his hand still resting on his belt. Jamal could feel the tension thickening in the air. He had been through situations like this before, but it never got easier. He knew that these moments could change in an instant. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," Riley said, his eyes narrowing. "And you matched the description of someone we're looking for." Jamal's mind raced. Suspicious activity? What kind of suspicious activity? He had just eaten breakfast, for heaven's sake. He could feel the anger rising within him, but he suppressed it. Now wasn't the time to let his emotions take over. He needed to stay calm, keep his composure. "I'm not sure how I could be involved in anything like that," Jamal said slowly, his voice carefully measured. "I've just been going about my morning. Maybe there's been a mistake." Riley stared at him for a long moment, the tension hanging in the air like a thick cloud. Jamal could see the gears turning in the officer's mind. Riley wanted something to be wrong. He wanted a reason to exert his authority, to make this into something bigger than it was. "I think we're going to have to bring you in for questioning," Riley said, his voice flat. Jenkins moved forward slightly, positioning himself as though ready to take action. Jamal's heart rate quickened. Questioning. For what? He had done nothing wrong. This was starting to feel like a setup, an unnecessary escalation. He had been respectful, cooperative, yet here he was being treated like a criminal. His mind flashed to the countless stories he had seen in the news. Innocent black men detained, harassed, or worse, all because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jamal's thoughts raced as he considered his options. He knew his rights, but asserting them now could escalate things further. He had to tread carefully. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I've done nothing wrong, and I don't think this is necessary," Jamal said, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable. But Riley wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind. "Turn around," he barked, his hand moving toward the cuffs on his belt. Jamal's pulse quickened. He could feel his muscles tense involuntarily. This was it. He was about to be arrested for no reason. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but that didn't seem to matter now. The police had decided he was guilty of something, even if they hadn't figured out what yet. Just as Riley was about to reach for Jamal, Jenkins' radio crackled to life. A voice came through, sharp and clear, cutting through the tension like a knife. "All units, we need assistance at a disturbance near 14th and Grand. Immediate response requested." Riley paused, his hand hovering in midair. He exchanged a look with Jenkins, who nodded slightly. For a moment, it seemed like they might let it go. But then Riley turned back to Jamal, his face hardening. "You're not off the hook. We'll be back," he said before turning and walking away. Jenkins followed, leaving Jamal standing there, heart pounding, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. As the two officers disappeared around the corner, Jamal let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He leaned against his car for a moment, trying to steady his nerves. He had narrowly avoided being taken in, but the encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth. He knew this wouldn't be the last time. Something about Riley's look told him that this wasn't over. And as Jamal finally opened the door to his car and sat down, his phone buzzed again. It was another message from his mother. "Love you. Be safe." Jamal exhaled slowly, his mind turning. He wasn't sure yet, but something told him that the events of today were just the beginning. There were still secrets he had kept hidden, ones that could change everything if revealed. For now, though, he'd carry on. He had work to do, and his mother's dinner to get to. But deep down, Jamal knew his world was about to be turned upside down. A sudden turn of events. Jamal drove through the bustling city streets, but his mind was far from the road. The encounter with Officers Riley and Jenkins clung to him like a thick fog, unsettling his usual calm. Despite his composed exterior, he couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger was at play. The look in Riley's eyes, the calculated aggression, it wasn't random. Jamal had felt this kind of scrutiny before, but today, it had felt different, more deliberate. As he weaved through the early morning traffic, his thoughts returned to the conversation he had overheard at the diner a few days earlier. He hadn't given it much thought at the time, dismissing it as local gossip, but now he wondered if it was connected. A couple of regulars, two older men who often sat in the corner booth, had been discussing rumors of corruption within the local police department. They had mentioned names, but one in particular stood out: Officer Riley. "He's been shaking down small businesses for months now," one of the men had said, his voice low. "If you don't pay, he makes your life hell." Jamal had dismissed it then, not wanting to involve himself in speculation. But now, after what had just happened, he wondered if there was more truth to it than he had initially thought. The idea that Riley was involved in something shady suddenly didn't seem far-fetched. As Jamal pulled up to his office building, a sleek, modern structure in the heart of the financial district, he tried to push the encounter out of his mind. He had more pressing matters to focus on. Today's meetings were crucial, and his position as vice president of one of the city's largest investment firms demanded his full attention. He parked in his reserved spot, checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, and straightened his tie. Despite the tension lingering from his encounter, Jamal looked as composed as ever. His sharp suit, clean-shaven face, and calm demeanor conveyed a sense of authority that few could challenge. He was used to walking into rooms where every eye turned to him, and he thrived in those environments. But today, something felt different. As he entered the building, the familiar faces of his colleagues greeted him with nods and smiles. His assistant, Clara, a petite woman with an incredible knack for organization, was already waiting at his office door, tablet in hand. "Good morning, Mr. West," she said brightly, her auburn hair pulled back into a neat bun. "You have back-to-back meetings today. The first one starts in 15 minutes. "Thanks, Clara. I'll need the notes for the conference call with the London office by noon. Also, can you reschedule the call with Mason until tomorrow?" Jamal asked as he walked past her into his office. "Of course," Clara replied smoothly, her fingers already flying across the screen of her tablet. "Oh, and Mr. West, there's a message for you from a Detective Harris. He said it's important." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. A detective. He hadn't been expecting anything like that. His mind flashed back to the encounter with Riley and Jenkins, and unease prickled at the back of his neck. What could this be about? Did he say what it was regarding? Jamal asked, keeping his voice steady as he reached for his phone. "No, just that it was important, and he would appreciate a call back as soon as possible," Clara replied. Jamal nodded, already dialing the number. He didn't like surprises, especially when they involved the police. As the phone rang, he mentally prepared himself for whatever this detective had to say. A voice on the other end answered after a few rings. "Detective Harris speaking." "Detective, this is Jamal West. I understand you left a message for me." "Ah, Mr. West, thank you for getting back to me so quickly. I was hoping we could arrange a time to meet. It's about an ongoing investigation." Jamal frowned. An investigation. He had no idea what this could be about, but the timing was too suspicious to be a coincidence. "I'm free after 5 p.m. today," Jamal said cautiously, his mind racing. "That works for me. I'll meet you at your office, if that's convenient." "Sure," Jamal replied, though he was already on edge. "I'll see you then." As he hung up, Jamal felt the knot in his stomach tighten. An investigation. Why would a detective be reaching out to him now, just hours after his encounter with those officers? Something was brewing, and he had a sinking feeling that he was about to be pulled into the middle of it. The day passed in a blur of meetings and calls, but Jamal's mind kept drifting back to the detective's message and the morning's unsettling events. By the time 5 p.m. rolled around, he was more than ready for some answers. Clara knocked on his office door shortly before the hour, poking her head in. "Detective Harris is here to see you, Mr. West." Jamal nodded and took a deep breath. "Send him in." The man who entered wasn't what Jamal had expected. Detective Harris was tall, with a lean, wiry frame and a weathered face that suggested years of hard work. His graying hair was closely cropped, and his sharp eyes took in the room as he walked toward Jamal's desk. Despite his worn appearance, there was a certain air of authority about him that Jamal immediately recognized. "Mr. West," Harris said, extending his hand. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice." "Detective," Jamal replied, shaking his hand. "Please, have a seat." Harris sat down, placing a small notebook on his lap. He glanced at Jamal before speaking, his tone careful, as if choosing his words deliberately. "I'm here because your name came up in connection with an ongoing investigation into some officers in this precinct. Specifically, Officers Riley and Jenkins." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Riley and Jenkins. The same officers who had harassed him that morning. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. "What kind of investigation?" Jamal asked, leaning forward slightly. Harris sighed. "Corruption. We've had reports that certain officers in the department have been involved in illegal activities. Extortion, shaking down local businesses, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, it goes deeper than just a few bad cops. There's a network, and we're working to unravel it." Jamal stared at the detective, his thoughts spinning. Corruption, shakedowns, it all lined up too perfectly with what he had overheard at the diner. But why was his name coming up? "How am I involved in this?" Jamal asked, his voice steady but laced with suspicion. Harris paused for a moment before responding. "That's what I'm hoping to find out. It seems that Riley and Jenkins were particularly interested in you today. I don't know if they were acting on their own or if someone higher up is targeting you specifically, but we've intercepted some communications that suggest they were planning something." Jamal's pulse quickened. So this wasn't just a random stop. They had been looking for him. But why? What did they want from him? "Do you have any idea why they might be after you?" Harris asked, watching Jamal closely. Jamal hesitated. Should he tell the detective about the conversation he had overheard at the diner? About Riley's reputation in the neighborhood? He wasn't sure how much he could trust Harris, but he knew that keeping quiet could potentially put him in more danger. "I overheard some things at a diner a few days ago," Jamal said slowly. "Some of the regulars were talking about Riley. They said he's been involved in shaking down small businesses, pressuring them for money. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but after what happened today..." Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That fits with what we've been hearing. Riley's been on our radar for a while, but he's careful. It's hard to get anything solid on him." Jamal leaned back in his chair, trying to process everything. "So, what happens now?" "We keep investigating. I wanted to meet with you because I think you might be a target. I don't know if it's because of your position or something else, but Riley and Jenkins are interested in you for a reason. I'd advise you to be careful, Mr. West. Keep an eye on who you talk to, where you go. And if anything feels off, you call me." Harris stood, his face serious. "We'll be in touch, but remember, these guys play dirty. Don't underestimate them." Jamal nodded, watching as the detective left his office. His mind was racing, the weight of the situation settling over him like a heavy cloak. He had known something wasn't right, but now it was clear. He was caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than he had realized. As he sat back in his chair, Jamal couldn't help but wonder what the officers really wanted from him, and more importantly, who else was involved. One thing was certain, though: the game had just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. Unraveling the layers. Jamal sat in his office long after Detective Harris had left, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and deep blue, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed by the detective's warnings, the events of the morning, and the disturbing realization that he was now a target in a much larger game, one he hadn't asked to play. Why him? That question hung heavy in the air, pressing down on him with a weight he couldn't shake. He was no stranger to navigating complex situations. His career had been built on making difficult decisions under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't a business deal gone awry or a challenging negotiation. This was a dangerous web of corruption, and somehow his name had been pulled into it. Jamal's fingers drummed lightly on the armrest of his leather chair as he mulled over the pieces of the puzzle. Riley and Jenkins had clearly been after something more than just harassing him this morning. That much was certain now. But why would corrupt cops target him? He wasn't involved in any criminal activity, nor did he have any known connections to the underworld. In fact, Jamal had built his career on integrity. He had worked hard to distance himself from the stereotypes that often plagued successful black men in his field. His thoughts drifted to his family, particularly his father. His father had been a man of principle, always insisting that his children hold their heads high and never back down in the face of injustice. Jamal remembered those lessons well. Growing up, his father had instilled in him the values of hard work, perseverance, and the importance of staying grounded in the face of adversity. He had always been a proud man, a community leader who commanded respect. But his father had also been involved in something more, something Jamal didn't fully understand until he was much older. A memory surfaced, one he hadn't thought about in years. When Jamal was a teenager, his father had been approached by local community leaders to help with a campaign against police corruption. It had been a turbulent time in the city, with accusations of police misconduct rampant. His father, being the strong, outspoken man he was, had taken on a leadership role in the movement. He had worked tirelessly to expose corrupt officers, attending community meetings, organizing protests, and gathering evidence. It had been a dangerous endeavor, one that had ultimately cost him a great deal. Jamal remembered the night his father came home with a broken nose and bruised ribs, his clothes torn and bloodied. His mother had been beside herself with worry, begging him to step back from the fight. But his father had refused, standing firm in his belief that justice had to be served, no matter the personal cost. Looking back, Jamal realized just how much his father's fight had shaped his own life. It had instilled in him a deep sense of responsibility, a duty to stand up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against him. Was this somehow connected to his father's past? Could Riley and Jenkins be part of the same corrupt system his father had fought so hard against? The thought gnawed at him, but there was no way to know for sure. His father had passed away years ago, taking many of those secrets with him. But if there was one thing Jamal had learned from his father, it was that nothing in this city was ever as simple as it seemed. Jamal glanced at his phone, noticing the time. His dinner with his mother was only an hour away. Normally, he looked forward to their dinners. His mother was a grounding force in his life, always full of warmth and wisdom. But tonight, he felt a strange sense of apprehension. Could he tell her about what had happened today? Would she even want to know? He decided to push those thoughts aside for now. There was no point in worrying her unnecessarily. Instead, he made a mental note to check in with a few trusted contacts, people who might have more insight into the situation. Jamal had spent years cultivating relationships with key figures across the city, from business leaders to political insiders. If there was more to this story, someone in his network would know. Jamal arrived at his mother's house just before 7 p.m., pulling up to the small, well-kept home in the suburbs where he had grown up. The house was a stark contrast to the sleek modern buildings he was accustomed to now, but it held a sense of nostalgia and comfort that no amount of luxury could replace. As he stepped out of his car, the familiar scent of jasmine filled the air from the garden his mother tended so lovingly. He paused for a moment, letting the peacefulness of the setting wash over him. No matter how chaotic his life became, this place always felt like home. He knocked lightly on the front door, and a moment later, his mother opened it with a bright smile. "Jamal, Right on time. As always, she said, pulling him into a warm hug. She was a small woman, barely reaching his chest, but her embrace had the strength and comfort only a mother could provide. "Hey, Mom," Jamal greeted her, kissing her on the cheek. "You know I wouldn't miss dinner with you for the world." She ushered him inside, the familiar smell of her cooking filling the air. "I made your favorite, gumbo," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I hope you came hungry." They sat down to dinner, the conversation flowing easily at first, as it always did. His mother asked him about his work, about his colleagues, and about the latest happenings in the city. But as the meal went on, Jamal found it harder to stay present. His mind kept wandering back to the day's events, to Riley and Jenkins, to the detective's warnings. His mother, ever perceptive, noticed his distraction. She set down her spoon and looked at him with concern. "Something's bothering you, isn't it?" she asked gently. Jamal hesitated, not wanting to worry her, but knowing that keeping it all to himself would only make things worse. His mother had always been his confidant, and despite his reservations, he knew she would want to know what was going on. "Yeah, something happened today," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "I had a run-in with the police. They stopped me for no reason. And things got tense." His mother's face tightened, worry creasing her brow. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" "No, I'm fine," Jamal reassured her quickly. But it wasn't just a routine stop. They were after something. And later, a detective reached out to me. He said my name had come up in an investigation into police corruption. His mother's eyes widened. "Corruption? Jamal, what is going on?" "I'm not sure yet," he replied, running a hand through his hair. "But I have a feeling it's bigger than just a few bad cops, and I can't help but think it's connected to something that happened years ago." His mother's expression shifted, and Jamal could see the recognition in her eyes. She knew exactly what he was talking about. "Your father," she said quietly. Jamal nodded. "Do you think it could be connected? Could this be fallout from what he was involved in back then?" His mother was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant as she considered the possibility. Finally, she sighed. "Your father fought hard to expose the truth, Jamal. He knew it was dangerous, but he believed in what he was doing. If this is connected to what happened back then you need to be careful. There are people in this city who don't want the truth to come out." Jamal's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from his mother made it all the more real. He was standing at the edge of something dangerous, and the stakes were higher than he had anticipated. "Don't worry, Mom. I'm going to be careful," he promised, though he could see the fear in her eyes. "You're just like him, you know," she said softly. "Stubborn and brave. But remember, you don't have to do this alone. If things get too dangerous, you need to walk away." Jamal nodded, though he knew walking away wasn't really an option. Not anymore. He was in too deep, and the more he uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. As they finished dinner, Jamal felt a renewed sense of determination. His father's legacy, the lessons he had learned growing up, the fight for justice, it all led to this moment. The corruption in the police department had taken root long ago, and now it seemed to be resurfacing with a vengeance. The question was, how deep did it go, and who, besides Riley and Jenkins, was involved? One thing was certain. Jamal wasn't going to sit back and wait for the storm to come to him. He was going to find answers, no matter the cost. But he knew he would need to be smart, strategic, and careful. There were too many moving parts, too many unknown players, and one wrong step could cost him everything. As he hugged his mother goodbye and headed back to his car, the weight of the situation settled over him once more. But this time, it didn't feel as overwhelming. Instead, it felt like a challenge, one that he was ready to face head-on. For Jamal, this was no longer just about clearing his name. This was about justice, and like his father before him, the first step into darkness. The following days passed in a blur of tension and anticipation. Jamal was acutely aware of the danger lurking just beneath the surface of his life. The city buzzed with its usual energy, but for him, everything felt different. Every siren, every police car that passed by his office made him hyper-aware of the officers behind the badge, particularly Riley and Jenkins. Their faces haunted him, their intent wrapped in a layer of deceit that felt almost palpable. The detective's warning echoed in his mind as he navigated through his daily responsibilities. He had always prided himself on being a man of action, someone who took charge and sought solutions. But now he felt like a chess piece, moving cautiously across a board riddled with hidden traps. He started his mornings with the same routine, coffee in hand, scanning the news headlines for any updates about police activity in the city. He had instructed Clara to keep an ear to the ground, asking her to be vigilant about any whispers concerning Riley and Jenkins. They had crossed a line, and Jamal was determined to ensure that he didn't become another victim of their corruption. On Friday evening, a breakthrough came when Jamal received a text from an old friend, Andra, who worked as a journalist for a local news outlet. They had grown up together in the same neighborhood, and Andra had a knack for digging up stories that others overlooked. Andra heard some chatter about Riley and Jenkins. They've been making moves against some local business owners. Let's meet. Jamal's heart raced at the prospect. He texted back quickly, agreeing to meet at a cafe known for its discretion. He needed allies, and Andra's expertise could prove invaluable. Later that evening, Jamal arrived at the cafe, a cozy spot with dim lighting and soft music playing in the background. As he stepped inside, the smell of fresh coffee mingled with baked goods, wrapping him in a sense of comfort. He spotted Andra at a corner table, his tall frame and distinctive curls easily identifiable. "Jamal, over here." Andra waved him over, a look of urgency in his eyes. As Jamal approached, he noticed the tension on his friend's face. "What did you find?" Jamal asked, sliding into the seat opposite Andra. Andra leaned in, his voice lowered. "I've been hearing rumors that Riley and Jenkins are involved in more than just shakedowns. There's talk of them being part of a larger ring. They're not working alone. They're connected to some serious players in organized crime." Jamal's stomach dropped. This was worse than he had feared. "Who? Do you have names?" Andra nodded. "I have some leads. A few names came up in the context of a protection racket targeting small businesses. It seems they've been using their badges to intimidate owners into paying them for protection. If they don't pay, they face harassment or worse." Jamal felt a cold sweat form on the back of his neck. This was what his father had fought against, a toxic system that preyed on the vulnerable. "So they're shaking down business owners. This isn't just about me, then." "Exactly," Andrew said, his eyes sharp. "They're hurting the community, and it's only going to escalate unless someone steps in." Jamal leaned back in his chair, thoughts racing. "What do you suggest we do?" Andrew's expression turned serious. "I can start digging deeper, but I'll need you to be cautious. If they catch wind that we're investigating, they'll retaliate. You're already on their radar, and if they know you're looking into their activities, it could get dangerous." "I understand," Jamal replied, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He knew this wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about standing up for his community. "Let's start compiling evidence, anything we can find that links them to these businesses." "Agreed," Andrew said, taking a sip of his coffee. "We'll need to move quickly but quietly. I'll dig through public records, talk to sources, and see what I can find. But Jamal, promise me you'll be careful if they get wind of our investigation." "I will," Jamal interrupted, his resolve hardening. "I'm not backing down." As they continued to talk, Jamal's determination grew. He felt the spark of a plan forming, an opportunity to turn the tide against Riley and Jenkins. They would not get away with their corrupt activities. Not on his watch. The next day, Jamal visited the local community center, a hub for residents and small business owners in the area. He had volunteered here in the past, and it felt like the right place to start gathering information. The director, Miss Thompson, had always been an ally, and she might have insights into what was happening in the neighborhood. As he walked through the familiar halls adorned with vibrant art made by local children, he was greeted by warm smiles and friendly nods. Miss Thompson, a strong woman with a fierce dedication to her community, was in her office sorting through paperwork when he knocked on the door. "Jamal, it's so good to see you," she exclaimed, her face lighting up. "How have you been?" "I'm doing well, Miss Thompson," Jamal replied, settling into a chair across from her desk. "But I'm here because I need your help." "Of course. What's going on?" she asked, concern creeping into her voice. "I've been hearing rumors about police harassment in the area. I know you work closely with the local business owners. Have you heard anything?" Miss Thompson's expression shifted, her brows furrowing. "Yes, unfortunately. There have been several complaints lately about Riley and Jenkins. They've been showing up at businesses unannounced, asking for money under the guise of protection. It's disgusting." Jamal felt anger welling up inside him. "How many businesses have been affected?" "At least a dozen that I know of," she replied, shaking her head. "They're using intimidation tactics, threatening to shut down operations if the owners don't comply. It's creating a climate of fear." "Is there anyone willing to speak up against them?" Jamal asked, urgency building in his voice. "Many are too scared to say anything. They fear retaliation, not just from the officers, but from their own peers. It's a tough position to be in," she admitted, frustration evident in her tone. Jamal took a deep breath, trying to think of a way to encourage the owners to come forward. "What if we organized a meeting? If we can gather a group of them together, maybe they'll feel more empowered to share their experiences. Strength in numbers, right?" Miss Thompson smiled slightly, her eyes brightening at the idea. "That could work. I can help you reach out to them. But you must be careful, Jamal. The last thing we want is to escalate the situation further." "Understood," Jamal said, determination etched into his features. "I just want to help, and I can't stand by while they hurt our community." They spent the next hour brainstorming ways to organize the meeting, discussing the best approach to ensure that the business owners felt safe enough to share their stories. They decided to hold it in the community center, where the atmosphere would be familiar and supportive. As Jamal left the center, a new sense of purpose coursed through him. He felt the weight of his father's legacy pressing on him, a reminder of the responsibility he carried to stand up against injustice. He would do whatever it took to help his community and expose the truth. That evening, after a long day of preparation, Jamal received a call from Andrew, his journalist friend. "I've been doing some digging," Andrew said, his voice urgent. "I got a tip that there's going to be a meeting involving some shady dealings at a bar downtown, and Riley and Jenkins are going to be there. This could be our chance to gather evidence." "Are you serious?" Jamal's heart raced at the possibility. "We have to go." "I'll text you the details," Andrew replied. "But you need to be careful. We can't go in there guns blazing. We need to observe, gather information, and get out without drawing attention." Jamal nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. He had to be smart about this. It was time to confront the darkness lurking within the very system that was meant to protect the community. As night fell, Jamal prepared for the mission. He dressed in casual clothes, a simple black shirt and jeans, trying to blend in rather than stand out. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. This was not just about him anymore. This was about the community, about standing against a tide of corruption that threatened to drown those who couldn't fight for themselves. When he arrived at the bar, the atmosphere was thick with tension and smoke. The dimly lit room was filled with a mix of laughter and hushed conversations, but Jamal's focus was clear. He scanned the crowd, looking for Andrew. There, he thought, spotting his friend at the far end of the bar, his eyes locked on a small group of men gathered around a table. Jamal approached, and Andrew nodded in greeting. "They're over there," he whispered, gesturing discreetly with his chin. Riley and Jenkins are sitting with some others. Keep your distance, but we need to listen. Jamal's pulse quickened as he moved closer, positioning himself near the bar where he could overhear the conversation without being seen. He glanced at the group, taking in Riley and Jenkins, their demeanor relaxed, as if they didn't have a care in the world. Just keep the pressure on the businesses, and we'll get our cut, Riley was saying, a smirk on his face. They don't know how to fight back. Most of them are scared. Jamal's stomach churned. This wasn't just a conversation. It was a confession. They were openly discussing their scheme. Andrew was recording the conversation discreetly on his phone, his brow furrowed in concentration. You think anyone's going to challenge us? Jenkins replied, leaning back in his chair with a laugh. We've got the entire department in our pocket. Jamal's breath hitched. The level of corruption was staggering. They were entrenched in a system that had failed the very community it was supposed to protect. As the minutes passed, Jamal and Andrew remained on high alert, listening closely. The conversation shifted to names, business owners they had targeted, and specific instances of intimidation. Then, as if the universe had conspired against them, Jamal felt a sudden presence behind him. He turned slightly to see a figure looming over him, one of the bar's bouncers. You're not supposed to be here, the bouncer growled, his tone low and threatening. Jamal's heart raced, but he held his ground. I'm just here for a drink. The bouncer narrowed his eyes, clearly unconvinced. I don't like the look of you. You should leave. Before Jamal could respond, Andrew discreetly tugged at his sleeve. Let's go, he murmured urgently, sensing the tension. Jamal nodded, unwilling to risk drawing attention. They stepped away from the bar and moved toward the exit, but as they turned the corner, they collided with Riley and Jenkins, who were making their way toward the door. Jamal's heart raced. He felt exposed, as if every nerve in his body was screaming at him to run. But he couldn't let fear control him now. He had to be brave, just like his father had taught him. Riley's eyes locked onto Jamal's, recognition dawning in his expression. Well, look who we have here, he said, his tone dripping with mockery. What's a soup like you doing in a place like this? Jamal steeled himself, refusing to back down. Just enjoying the night, he replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. You're not going to go blabbing to anyone about what you overheard, are you? Jenkins sneered, stepping closer. Before Jamal could respond, Andrew, quick on his feet, interjected. We're just leaving. No need to get worked up. Jamal could see the tension in Andrew's posture, his friend ready to defend them both if needed. But Jamal knew they couldn't afford to escalate the situation. They were outnumbered and under threat. That's right, boys, Jamal said smoothly, forcing a smile. Just two regular guys enjoying the night. No harm, no foul. Riley's gaze flickered with annoyance, but he seemed to sense the energy in the room changing. You'd better stay out of our business, West, he warned, taking a step back. We don't take kindly to snoopers. With that, they moved past Jamal and Andre, slipping into the crowd. Jamal exhaled slowly, his heart racing from the close call. They had gathered crucial information, but now the stakes were higher than ever. We need to get out of here, Andrew said, his voice urgent as they pushed through the bar's exit. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hit them like a wave, grounding Jamal momentarily. He felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with fear. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. What do we do next? Andrew asked, glancing over his shoulder. We gather our evidence and go public, Jamal replied, determination hardening in his chest. But we need to be careful. We can't let them know we're onto them. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about the entire community. Andrew nodded, his expression serious. Let's head to my place. We'll sort through everything and come up with a plan. As they drove through the city, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that they were now in a game of high stakes. He thought of his mother, of the community he cared about, and of the legacy his father had left behind. There was no turning back. They were going to fight, and they were going to win. But in a city riddled with corruption, they would need to be smart, strategic, and above all, brave. And Jamal was ready to face whatever darkness lay ahead. Uncovering the shadows. The following day was one of the longest Jamal had ever experienced. He awoke early, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The weight of responsibility hung heavy on his shoulders, but a fire ignited within him. He couldn't allow Riley and Jenkins to continue their reign of terror. As he prepared for the day, Jamal found himself reflecting on his father's teachings. His father had faced discrimination and adversity, yet he had always stood tall and fought for what was right. Jamal vowed to carry that spirit forward, honoring his father's legacy while protecting his community. After a quick breakfast, he headed to Andrew's apartment. They had decided to transform it into a command center for their investigation. As Jamal approached, he felt a rush of determination surge through him. This was no longer just about revenge. It was about justice, community, and truth. Andrew welcomed him inside, and the two men immediately began sorting through their findings. A whiteboard took center stage, covered in notes, names, and connections. They had gathered information about the small businesses affected by Riley and Jenkins' intimidation tactics, and now it was time to connect the dots. "We need to compile a timeline," Andrew suggested, his brow furrowed in concentration. "If we can show a pattern of behavior, it will strengthen our case." Jamal nodded, grabbing a marker and jotting down dates. "Let's start with the businesses that reported harassment. If we can pinpoint when each incident occurred, it could lead us to their next targets." As the hours passed, they pieced together a compelling narrative. Jamal's heart raced as they discovered that the officers had visited several businesses in a specific sequence. The pattern was unsettling. Every establishment had something in common. They were all owned by people of color, struggling to keep their heads above water in a challenging economy. "This is systematic," Jamal said, anger boiling within him. "They're targeting vulnerable people who can't fight back." Andrew looked up, determination mirrored in his eyes. "And we're going to do something about it. We need to document everything and gather testimonials from the victims." Just then, Jamal's phone buzzed, interrupting their flow. He glanced at the screen to see a message from Miss Thompson. "Miss Thompson, Jamal, we need to talk. Some of the business owners are ready to come forward, but they're scared. Can we meet?" Jamal's heart raced. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the opportunity to gather testimonials from those directly affected. He quickly replied, agreeing to meet at the community center. "Let's head over. This could be the turning point we need." As they drove through the familiar streets, Jamal felt the pulse of the community around him. The vibrant murals, the sounds of laughter, the scent of street food wafting through the air, all of it reminded him why he was fighting. This wasn't just about him. It was about the fabric of the neighborhood he loved. Arriving at the community center, Jamal spotted Miss Thompson waiting by the entrance. Her expression was a mix of hope and trepidation. "Thank you for coming, Jamal," she said, her voice steady but tinged with worry. "I've gathered a few owners who are willing to share their stories, but they're afraid." Jamal nodded, feeling the gravity of the moment. "We'll do everything we can to protect them. Let's meet in the conference room." As they entered the room, Jamal was struck by the diversity of the people gathered there. Each face reflected resilience, yet each also bore the weight of fear. It was clear that they had been through a lot. "Thank you all for being here," Jamal began, his voice steady as he addressed the group. "I know how difficult this is, but your stories matter. Together, we can stand against the intimidation and corruption that's affecting our community." One of the owners, a middle-aged woman named Clara, spoke up first. "I own a small grocery store on the corner of 5th and Maple. Riley and Jenkins showed up one night, demanding money for protection. They said if I didn't pay, they would make sure my store had accidents. I was terrified." Jamal felt a wave of anger surge within him. This was the reality that too many faced: fear from those sworn to protect them. Thank you for sharing that, Clara. Your courage is commendable. Another man, a young owner of a barbershop, chimed in. I've been threatened too. They told me they'd shut down my shop if I didn't pay them. I'm trying to build my business, but every time I turn around, they're there. Jamal listened intently as more voices joined the conversation. Each story painted a more vivid picture of the reality they faced. After they finished sharing their experiences, Jamal felt the energy in the room shift. He sensed the camaraderie forming among the owners as they realized they weren't alone in this fight. I know it's scary, he said, addressing them all. But we can't let fear control us. Together, we're stronger, and together, we can hold them accountable. Ms. Thompson stepped forward, her expression resolute. We'll support one another. If we compile our stories, document what's been happening, we can approach the media and the city council. We have to take this to the next level. Jamal nodded, heartened by her words. Let's gather everything we have, the testimonies, the timelines, any evidence we can find. If we present a united front, they can't ignore us. The group agreed, a newfound energy pulsing through the room. They started planning their next steps, discussing how to reach out to more victims and compile their stories. Jamal felt the sense of purpose he had been searching for solidify into action. As the meeting wrapped up, Jamal caught Andrew's eye. He knew they had a long road ahead, but something was shifting. This was no longer just about his fight for justice. It had transformed into a movement, a reckoning. Thank you all for your bravery today, Jamal said, his voice filled with emotion. Let's keep each other informed and remember, we're in this together. We will rise against this corruption. As the group dispersed, Jamal felt a sense of hope blooming within him. He was reminded that in times of adversity, community was a powerful force. He left the center with Andre, both men feeling the weight of their mission. What's next? Andre asked, determination etched on his face. We need to compile everything we've gathered, get the testimonies in writing, and prepare for a press conference. Jamal replied, his mind racing with possibilities. We need to expose Riley and Jenkins for who they truly are. Andrew nodded, a spark of excitement in his eyes. Let's hit the ground running. We'll draft a press release and start reaching out to local news outlets. Over the next few days, Jamal and Andrew worked tirelessly to prepare. They gathered testimonies from the business owners, ensuring every detail was documented. Jamal reached out to his contacts in the community, seeking additional support and allies who could amplify their voices. As they compiled their findings, they began to notice a pattern, beyond just the police officers. The community had been systematically targeted by various entities, all interconnected in a web of corruption that ran deep. They created a comprehensive dossier that detailed the officers' activities, the affected businesses, and the fear that had gripped the community. The evidence was undeniable. When the day of the press conference arrived, Jamal felt a mix of nerves and excitement. He stood at the podium, looking out at a crowd of reporters, cameras flashing, and community members standing in solidarity behind him. Thank you all for coming today, Jamal began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. We are here to expose a reality that has plagued our community for far too long. Riley and Jenkins have used their badges to instill fear, shake down business owners, and exploit the vulnerable. Today, we stand united against this corruption. The room was silent as he spoke, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Jamal felt the strength of the stories behind him, the courage of the community he was representing. He detailed the evidence they had gathered, presenting testimonials from business owners who had faced intimidation and threats. Each story resonated with the audience, the gravity of the situation growing clearer by the minute. And today, we demand justice, he concluded, his voice rising with conviction. We will not be silenced, and we will not back down. We will hold Riley and Jenkins accountable, and we will reclaim our community. As he stepped back from the podium, a wave of emotion washed over him. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Jamal felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to turn the tide against the forces that had sought to oppress them. The reporters surged forward with questions, their curiosity piqued. Jamal and Andrew took turns fielding inquiries, detailing their findings and the next steps they intended to take. They had captured the attention of the media, and with it came the power of visibility. As the press conference wrapped up, Jamal felt the weight of the moment. He had taken the first steps into the light, shedding light on the shadows that had loomed over their community for too long. But even as he celebrated this victory, he knew that the battle was just beginning. Riley and Jenkins would not take this lying down. That evening, as he returned home, Jamal was filled with a mixture of exhilaration and apprehension. He had become a beacon of hope for his community, but he also knew that he had placed a target on his back. After dinner, he picked up his phone, scrolling through the messages that had flooded in since the press conference. Support from friends, family, and even strangers poured in, but mixed with that was a nagging sense of unease. Then, a new message came through from Andrew. "Andrew, we need to talk. Things are heating up. I have some intel that you need to see." Jamal's heart sank. He could feel the tension in the air thickening. What now? He whispered to himself, a sense of dread creeping in. He quickly replied, asking Andrew to meet at the community center again. As he prepared to leave, he glanced at his reflection in the mirror, taking a moment to steel himself for what lay ahead. Arriving at the center, Jamal found Andrew pacing anxiously. "What's going on?" Jamal asked, his pulse quickening. "I overheard something while I was at the barbershop today. Some of the regulars were talking about a plan Riley and Jenkins have. They're trying to intimidate the owners who spoke out, and they're going to escalate things," Andrew explained, his eyes wide with concern. Jamal felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, escalate?" "They're planning a raid. They want to make an example out of someone to send a message," Andrew replied, his voice low. "They know we're onto them, and they're not going to back down easily." Jamal's mind raced. This was the very fear they had fought against, being silenced through violence and intimidation. But he also felt a surge of determination. "We can't let them win. We need to warn the others." He and Andrew quickly gathered the business owners, sending out urgent messages and making calls. They needed everyone to be aware of what was coming. As the owners arrived at the center, Jamal felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Listen up," he said, addressing the group with urgency. "We've received intel that Riley and Jenkins are planning to raid one of your businesses to intimidate you all into silence. We need to be prepared." Gasps filled the room as the implications sank in. "Which business?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Jamal shook his head, frustration rising within him. "We don't know yet, but we can't wait to find out. We need to come together and create a plan. We have to protect one another." Andrew stepped forward. "Let's divide into groups and keep watch over each business. If we see something suspicious, we alert the others immediately." The group nodded in agreement, a newfound sense of purpose igniting among them. They began to strategize, deciding on a rotating schedule to ensure that each business was monitored. As the meeting concluded, Jamal felt a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. They were building a network of support, ready to stand against the tide of fear that threatened to drown them. But as he left the center, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a tightrope, balancing between justice and retaliation. He knew they had to be careful, but the stakes were higher than ever. In the days that followed, Jamal and Andrew worked tirelessly to monitor the businesses. Tension hung thick in the air, each creak of a floorboard or rustle of leaves sending their hearts racing. But they stood firm, determined to protect their community. As the weekend approached, Jamal's phone buzzed with a message from Miss Thompson. "Miss Thompson, there's been talk that they're going to strike soon. We need to be ready." Jamal's heart sank. They had to act fast. He quickly gathered everyone for another meeting, sensing the urgency in the air. "We need to set up a community watch," Jamal proposed, his voice firm. We can't let them catch us off guard. Everyone deserves to feel safe in their own business. Clara spoke up. What about using social media? If we spread the word, more people will be aware and could join our cause. Jamal nodded, impressed by her insight. That's a great idea. Let's create a community page where we can share information, updates, and alerts. They quickly organized a plan, creating a social media presence that showcased their unity. The page began to gain traction, drawing attention from those outside their community. As the likes and shares multiplied, Jamal felt a sense of empowerment growing among them. The day of the planned raid arrived, and Jamal and the others remained on high alert. They had set up a system of alerts, ready to respond to any suspicious activity. Tension gripped the air as they patrolled the streets, their hearts pounding with anticipation. As night fell, Jamal and Anders stationed themselves outside Clara's grocery store. The streetlights flickered, casting shadows that danced ominously on the pavement. They exchanged nervous glances, each knowing the gravity of the situation. Jamal felt a sense of purpose surge within him. They were no longer just bystanders in their story. They were actively writing their narrative. Hours passed, and just as they began to feel a flicker of hope, a patrol car rolled into view. Jamal's heart raced as he exchanged glances with Ander. "Is that them?" Ander whispered, his voice tense. Jamal nodded, bracing himself. They watched as Riley and Jenkins stepped out of the car, their expressions cold and predatory. "They're coming for Clara," Jamal breathed, his fists clenching. As the officers approached, Jamal quickly grabbed his phone, ready to record. "We can't let them intimidate her again," he said, determination flooding his voice. The tension reached a boiling point as Riley and Jenkins stepped into the store. Clara stood behind the counter, her expression shifting from fear to defiance as she spotted the officers. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice strong despite the fear in her eyes. Riley leaned against the counter, a smug smile on his face. "Just checking in on our favorite store owner. You've been a little quiet lately, haven't you?" Jamal's heart pounded as he recorded the interaction. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. "You have no right to come in here and harass me," Clara replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm not afraid of you." Jenkins chuckled darkly, leaning closer. "You should be. We can make life pretty miserable for you if you keep up this attitude." But just then, a group of community members burst through the door. People Jamal had rallied through social media. They had come to support Clara, standing tall and united against the threat. "Leave her alone," someone shouted, and the room erupted into a chorus of voices demanding respect and justice. The officers glanced at each other, visibly taken aback by the sudden crowd. Jamal seized the moment, stepping forward with his phone raised high. "You can't intimidate us anymore. We are standing together against your corruption." Riley's smug expression faltered as the realization sank in. This was no longer just Clara's fight. This was a community standing up for what was right. "You're making a mistake, West," Jenkins spat, his voice laced with venom. "You have no idea who you're messing with." But Jamal stood firm, his resolve unyielding. "We know exactly who we're messing with, and we're not backing down." The confrontation escalated, and the officers quickly realized they were outnumbered. Riley and Jenkins exchanged glances, their bravado faltering in the face of the community's solidarity. With that, Jamal stepped forward, capturing the moment on his phone. "You're on camera now, officers. Your intimidation tactics won't work anymore." As the crowd continued to chant for justice, the officers hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Finally, with a snarl, Riley turned on his heel, gesturing for Jenkins to follow him. "This isn't over," he spat, retreating from the store. Jamal watched as the officers left, a wave of relief washing over him. They had stood up against the very system designed to intimidate them, and in that moment, they had reclaimed their power. In the days that followed, the community's courage became a rallying cry. Videos of the confrontation went viral, drawing attention from local news outlets and activists. People from all over began reaching out, offering support and solidarity. Jamal and Andrew found themselves at the forefront of a movement, one that aimed not only to expose Riley and Jenkins, but to reform the system that had allowed such corruption to fester. As the momentum grew, they organized town hall meetings, bringing in experts to educate the community about their rights. They shared strategies on how to document interactions with police, emphasizing the importance of standing united against injustice. Jamal felt a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. He was no longer just a man fighting for justice. He was a catalyst for change, igniting a movement that would leave a lasting impact on the community. But as they pushed forward, they knew they had to remain vigilant. Riley and Jenkins wouldn't let go easily, and Jamal had no doubt that they would retaliate in some way. One night, as Jamal was heading home, he received a text from Andrew. "Andrew, I just heard from a source that they're planning something big. We need to meet." Jamal's heart raced. The stakes were higher than ever. He quickly replied, agreeing to meet at the community center. When he arrived, Andrew was waiting, his expression grave. "I've heard whispers that they're planning to target you specifically. They want to silence you once and for all." Jamal felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean? How?" "They're talking about planting evidence, something to frame you and take you out of the picture," Andrew explained, his voice tense. "We can't let that happen. You need to be careful." Jamal's mind raced, processing the implications. He knew they would stoop to any level to protect their interests. But he also felt a surge of determination. "I won't back down, Andrew. We're fighting for something bigger than ourselves." Andrew nodded, but his concern was palpable. "We need to strategize. Let's bring in the community and keep them informed. If they see what's happening, we'll be safer together." As they devised a plan to spread the word, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced down corruption before, and he would do it again. He wouldn't let fear control his actions. The following weeks were a blur of activity. The community rallied behind Jamal, organizing events to raise awareness about police misconduct. He was invited to speak at schools, community centers, and churches, sharing his story and empowering others to stand up against injustice. But the shadow of Riley and Jenkins loomed large. Despite their efforts, the officers continued to operate with impunity, harassing those who spoke out. The fear they instilled was palpable, but Jamal was determined to break that cycle.